Waterfront Toronto, and as a borderline lifelong friend of Richard. Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jameson Stevie. I'm the Executive Director of the Martin Prosperity Institute here at the Rotman School. Thank you all very much for coming. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I am the opening act to the opening act, so I will be brief. My job here tonight is to have the pleasure of introducing Professor Merrick Gertler, President of the University of Toronto. Merrick is a friend of the Institute and the school, and he holds the Goldring Chair in Canadian Studies and is a professor of geography and planning. Among his many duties, he serves as a board member of both Mars Discovery District and Waterfront Toronto, and as a borderline lifelong friend of Richard Florida. I think all of his opening comments will be discounted accordingly. So with that, President Gertler.
Thank you, Jameson. Well, I am especially pleased to be welcoming you all to the University of Toronto and to be introducing our featured speaker, Professor Richard Florida. As Jameson has already suggested, I've known Richard a very long time. And, you know, as fellow urbanists, our paths first crossed many years ago. I won't say how many. But Richard was teaching at Ohio State at the time. Not long after that, he moved to Pittsburgh to teach at Carnegie Mellon. And not long after that, I invited Richard to speak at a conference here in Toronto. And that was the first of his many trips to this city, a series of visits that laid the groundwork for his eventual move to this wonderful Martin Prosperity Institute, the Rotman School of Management, and the University of Toronto about 10 years ago. Well, simply put, Richard Florida is one of the world's most influential thinkers about cities today. Indeed, I don't think it is any stretch at all to say that he has become one of the most influential thought leaders of our time, full stop. Like Jane Jacobs before him, Richard has a keen eye and a knack for drawing important insights from closely observing the world around him. His stint at Carnegie Mellon at a time when Pittsburgh was really struggling to reinvent its economy in the wake of a collapsing steel industry was instrumental in shaping his remarkable intellectual trajectory. Richard wondered why so many talented students at Carnegie Mellon University, University of Pittsburgh, and the other great post-secondary institutions in that city were leaving Pittsburgh upon graduating rather than staying and contributing to the city's regeneration. His investigation of this question sowed the seeds for the work that would ultimately culminate in the acclaimed 2002 bestseller, The Rise of the Creative Class. 4 decades after Jane Jacobs published her path-breaking book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, Richard Florida's The Rise of the Creative Class became arguably the single most influential book on cities in the new millennium. It has reshaped the way we think about the sources of prosperity, both local and national, and its insights have been adopted and applied by policymakers, planners, and politicians around the world. In hindsight, it also documented the emergence of a dynamic that may now be threatening to undermine the very prosperity we all strive for. And once again, Richard Florida, a keen student of urban life, has capitalized on his time in Toronto and his frequent visits to New York, London, and other world cities to discern a troubling winner-take-all turn in the evolution of cities today. This is the primary focus of his new book and the subject of his talk today. I think we are in for a real treat. Richard is the Director of Cities at the Martin Prosperity Institute here at Rotman. He serves as Senior Editor at The Atlantic magazine. He's co-founder and editor-at-large of the magazine's City Labs site, which discusses the most innovative ideas and pressing issues facing cities around the globe. He is a distinguished fellow at the Schack Institute of Real Estate at New York University, and he is founder of the Creative Class Group. In 2016, Richard was promoted to the rank of University Professor at the University of Toronto. This is our highest academic honor, and for those who don't know, this is a distinction that is held by fewer than 2% of our faculty. Last month, Basic Books published Richard's provocative new book, The New Urban Crisis: How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation, and Failing the Middle Class, and What We Can Do About It. Many of you are holding signed first edition copies, and Rotman Events staff will have books for sale when we adjourn at 6:15. Now, impressive as his new book is, Richard is most proud of being father to Mila, to whom he dedicated his new book, and Richard's wife, Rana, gave birth to their second daughter, Valentina, just 1 week ago. So, folks, please join me in congratulating Richard and Rana on their latest productions. And here comes Rana, perfectly timed. You just missed your applause. Welcome. So without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming our featured speaker, Professor Richard Florida.
Thank you, Marek. Thank you. Thank you, Marek. I think we met in 1984, if my math is correct. And we were introduced by a very eminent geographer, a man named Gordon Clark, who had been a supervisor of Marek's, I believe it was your PhD at Harvard, and actually recruited me. I had invited him to give a talk at Ohio State, recruited me to Carnegie Mellon. And Marek kindly, when I was completely unknown, I mean no one knew who the heck I was, would invite me up here, go visit your house in the annex. We'd come to conferences. And the day that really set the stage for this move, I think it was the opening of the Monk, what was then called the Monk Center or Monk Institute, before it was the Monk School. And Marek, I think very presciently, sat me beside our vice chancellor at the time, Heather Monroe Bloom. And I still remember what she said to me. We've hired many new deans, including a new dean named Martin. You guys will either love each other or hate one another. And that's what brought me here a decade ago. The second greatest move, most important move was marrying Rana, but the second greatest thing we did was to move here. And I see so many academic colleagues and academic friends and so much of our very large social network here. I said to Rana the other night, I'm done writing books. I'm tired. It's really lonely. It's not like playing rock and roll in my youth when you're with other people. You sit at a little desk. And she said, no, you dedicated this book to Mila. You have to write one more for Valentina. Oh, it's not over yet. Thanks to this great university, the Rotman family, for supporting our research in the Martin Prosperity Institute, my incredible team led by Jameson, and all of our folks who are here tonight who really do the hard work, which enables me to do what I do. And, of course, Rana, who runs the Creative Class Group and takes care of all the logistics and all those other matters in our life. I was born in 1957 in Newark, New Jersey. And that's an important fact. Because when I was a boy, growing up in Newark, Newark was a vital and vibrant city. My dad worked in a factory called Victory Optical in that city's great industrial district called the Ironbound District, so-called because it was bounded by tracks. My mom, when we got old enough to take care of ourselves, maybe my brother and I were 5 or 6 or 7, there was an ad taker in the great paper in Newark, the Newark Star-Ledger. Interestingly enough, hired by, this name some of you may know, hired personally by Cy Newhouse, the founder of the Newhouse empire, probably the largest news empire in the world. I came from a large Italian family. We would gather at my maternal grandmother's house. And by the time I was 2 or 3, my folks moved us to a suburb. It was not really a suburb. It was a working class little town where, if you know me, you've heard me say, everybody talk like this, how you doing, what you going through, very Italian working class place. But we'd still go back to visit my grandma and be surrounded by family on Sundays. Well, my dad only got to go to 7th grade. there were two things my folks really believed in. The first was education. They put me in a Catholic school. That's why they moved to this town called North Arlington. I, of course, have the scars on both hands from the nuns to prove that, if you want to see them later. And my father, who loved music, he loved the big bands, he loved Tommy Dorsey, he loved Frank Sinatra, wanted to give his two boys the gift of music. And, of course, we didn't want to play horns. We wanted to play rock and roll. So he bought me an electric guitar and my brother a drum set, and that was quite disruptive. But he said the deal he made with us is on Saturdays, if we were going to play music, we had to do two things with him. One, we had to go to the Newark Public Library. This is a guy with very little formal education, and where I would peruse the stacks of books and found my love of urbanism. And he would take me to my guitar lesson. And, of course, he found an old-school Italian-American guitar teacher in a town called Bloomfield, right outside of Newark, where we'd go. And one Saturday in July of 1967, as we drove through Newark, we heard bang, 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 bang. And my father said, "Rich, get down on the floor. Rich, get down on the floor." And so I dove on the floor of his 1960-something Chevy Impala. And Newark, my city, had exploded into riots. There were armored vehicles on the street. There were tanks. There were National Guardsmen and police. And I think as a 10-year-old, something triggered. I don't know what it was, but I saw the city where I was born go up in flames. I saw blocks smoldering and simmering. I saw police and armored vehicles. I saw the military occupying a city. And that was the birth of the old urban crisis. People fled Newark. All of our relatives moved to the surrounding area. My dad's factory closed. My mother's Star Ledger was ringed with fences and barbed wire. The old urban crisis was a crisis of economic failure of the urban center, a flight of the middle class. And I didn't know it at the time, but it must have made its imprint. By the time I was graduating high school in 1975, and my little town overlooked New York, I could watch the New York skyline. I actually watched the Twin Towers being erupted by the little bluff overlooking the Hudson River. New York City declared bankruptcy. Well, I went off to college at Rutgers College, a very important experience because it lifted me out of a tough guy Italian carousing culture and allowed me to actually pursue my interest and be smart without threat of being beaten up, which was not, that's actually kind of a particularly problematic threat when people are going to beat you up, but that's a subject for another talk. Well, my parents wanted what's best for their kids, and so they wanted me, what else would you want your kid? He's doing well in school, he's been taken to the Newark Public Library, he's excelling in his Catholic school program, he has good grades, but he can't tell his friends for fear they'll beat him up. And you're going to be a doctor. Well, of course, as an impressionable young 17-year-old, I wanted to please my parents. I took pre-med whatever, and I got straight C's. And my parents then called a meeting of the entire extended Italian family. All of them they brought to New Brunswick, like 25 people, to impress upon me the fact that if medicine wasn't for me, perhaps dentistry was in my future. And I said to my mom, a lovely old Italian woman, "Mom, I think I want to be a lawyer." She said, "You know, Richard, that's a good choice. You're a good talker, just like me. You'll do good at that." And that was my ruse to study what I really loved, cities. And so the first semester I could take an elective, I took an elective with a geography professor, actually not much older than us, Merrick, a fellow named Bob Lake, who still runs the PhD program at Rutgers. He was a young assistant professor. And Bob Lake gave us an assignment. And the assignment was to take the Amtrak train from New Brunswick to New York City and walk from Chelsea, which was bombed out and declining, and there was no High Line Park. There was an old decrepit railroad. And there were real meatpacking plants. And then walk past the Flatiron Building and walk into Lower Manhattan. And I couldn't believe what I saw. This was not the declining and decaying Newark. This was not a city in fiscal crisis. This was a city seeing the seeds, the green shoots of an urban rebirth. There were hippies and bohemians and hipsters and punks and artists occupying the warehouse buildings where factories were actually occupied in Soho and Bohemian Greenwich Village, and I couldn't believe it. And that's what I wanted to do. So I pursued my studies. I lived in New York. I went and got a PhD at Columbia. I saw that urban revival happen. I said, maybe it could happen. Maybe cities really can come back. Maybe what happened to my Newark could be corrected. And as Merrick pointed out, I went to Ohio State, and in Columbus, I could see what was happening in their German village and the Short North neighborhood. I was just back there, and it is an amazing, incredible urban revival. And then I went to Pittsburgh in 1987. And in Pittsburgh, exactly as Merrick said, I saw this incredible technologically dynamic place. You know, we just announced today that Uber was establishing a center for self-driving cars in Toronto, hinged in large measure to our own Vector Institute, which comes from the incredible capacity in the computer science program here at the University of Toronto. Well, in Pittsburgh, I saw the first robotic tanks rolling. And, you know, I thought, if anyone asked me if robotic tanks would hold the seeds to the revival of Pittsburgh, I would have said, you're from the moon. But, of course, those seeds were growing in Pittsburgh, but they were going elsewhere. The faculty members who were excelling, not like here with Jeffrey, they weren't. Even if we tried to create institutes for them, they were moving to the San Francisco Bay Area. They were moving to Boston to be part of these startups. They were leaving, and my students, it's very interesting. Here, when I ask my MBA students, how many of you guys are going to stay in Toronto and come from all over the world, every hand goes up. In Pittsburgh, no hands went up. So I was grappling with why, and that's where Rise of the Creative Class came from. An idea that there was this new group of people, knowledge workers, professional workers, technology people, artists and musicians that were causing this urban revival, and they were attracted to vibrant and dense places that with exciting things to do, just like Toronto. So of course, when I was invited to join the faculty here and head up the Martin Prosperity Institute, I was excited. I remember we were living in Washington, D.C., and I called Rana, and I said, she said, yeah, I'd love to go to Toronto. You know, our family's from Michigan. It's very close, and it's a great city, and it's dynamic. And I came here, you know, with all of these naive American presumptions. Of course, a devotee of Jane Jacobs. Of course, I was coming to the center, Jane City, the center of progressive urbanism. And we know this city has warts, but trust me, Americans look at it through a different kind of rose-colored glasses. Toronto's where they're building buildings, and there's 114 cranes in the side. We know we have transit problems, but compared to cities like Detroit or others, you're building transit. They're talking about a subway extension. It's great. Look what's happening with brownfield development. Look at what's going on in Toronto. It was a case study in my graduate classes. And I come here, and David Miller was mayor, and I was working with David on inclusive prosperity, and Kyle Ray was a counselor. And all of a sudden, I wake up one morning, and Rob Ford is elected mayor. Like, holy moly. That was the moment. Where would Rob Ford come from? And it didn't dawn on me all at once. It took a little while, and of course, by that time, David Holchansky, our colleague David Holchansky, had done his incredible research on the divide. Zach Taylor, who was a graduate in the graduate program here, was looking at the political dynamics of that. And you could see that what Rob Ford was a product of was a divided city. A city where the creative class, my creative class, knowledge workers, professionals, young people, the highly educated, the affluent, and the advantaged, occupied the area of the downtown core. And the areas around the university. And Yorkville. And of course, as it extended out as the city grew, around the subway stops. Of course, we have great suburbs around natural amenities like coastlines and waterfronts, green spaces. But those who were pushed outside into the remaining disadvantaged areas of the city that weren't served by transit, were dislocated, or into the far-off periphery, they were growing angry. They were growing anxious. They were growing more concerned that the city was not serving them. It was serving a privileged elite. And that's where the germ of the new urban crisis came from. And I remember writing about this at the time. And of course I said, to anyone who would listen, if Rob Ford can happen in Toronto, more and worse will follow. So then I'm thinking, okay, the Brexit. Yeah, well, that's a trade thing. It'll be all right. Never in my wildest dreams could I have imagined the rise of Donald Trump. And that really, those divides, those fault lines, those cleavages are what is at stake in the new urban crisis. It's not just an urban crisis. I think, to put this in broad academic terms, what we are dealing with is the fundamental crisis of late capitalism, the fundamental contradiction of capitalism itself. If Marx said it was about the struggle of workers on the factory floor who produced things but couldn't share in its gains, this contradiction is different and it's bigger. Because the same clustering force that generates innovation and business startup and productivity improvement and economic growth. And, the person who figured this out was Jane Jacobs. When we would sit in her little house over here in the annex and talk about it, and she was the most humble of people. And, when you really pushed her, Jane, what do you think was the most important thing you figured out? She would say, if I had to really put it to you, it's this. Many other economists have studied things like the division of labor, vertically integrated companies, the importance of industrialization. What I think is I figured out a different way that economic growth works. And what she said it was is not just having large companies or large resource endowments or developing a fine-grained division of labor. What she said she thought she figured out is that the real motor of economic growth, productivity, innovation, rising living standards, comes when people like us, people from diverse backgrounds, walks of life, diverse ethnicities, sexual orientations, whatever, come together in densely packed communities. When we pack and clamor and clash in cities, it's that rubbing of shoulders, that collaborative interaction that produces innovation, productivity, and economic growth. Well, that same clustering that's the motor force of economic growth and has many great benefits, it's a two-headed monster. It's Janus-faced. That same clustering that drives economic growth is the very same force that carves these deep divides in our society. And I would argue further. It not only carves deep divides in our society. There's a person named Daniel Bell, one of a few scholars who had a very big influence on my own thinking. Daniel Bell wrote an initial book on post-industrial society. His second book was called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. He believed that capitalism was generating a series of cultural contradictions, you don't have to agree with this, that would ultimately cause its slowdown and demise. I would say the new urban crisis not only carves divides, but it creates a new political contradiction. And that political contradiction is manifest in the rise of Ford and Brexit and Trump and the sweep of populism, fortunately paused yesterday by our very courageous French friends. But the political contradiction is that it creates not only a class of people who can't keep up or are pushed further outside, but it creates a backlash. A backlash on the right and left which threatens the very engine of economic progress. I'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. So in the book, I say there are 5 dimensions to the new urban crisis. And in fact, if the old urban crisis was bad, this new urban crisis could actually be worse. And one thing that troubles me, and this is particularly the case here, because we're such an aspirational city, and because we have our sights set so high on our advance, when people want to poo-poo this and say, it's really just an adjustment. It's really just something that we can grow our way out of. If we just work harder, urbanization will solve. No, it won't. The first dimension of this crisis, Merrick said very eloquently, it's the rise of what I've come to call winner-take-all urbanism. For years, most of us, many of us, believed that urbanization in great cities, in knowledge hubs, even as it spread itself through the world, would be accompanied by many and mostly good things. Well, as early as 2005, I wrote a paper called The World is Spiky. The world wasn't flattening with this urbanization. In fact, as we globalized, the world became more clustered and more concentrated. I said in that paper where we use light emissions to estimate the real economic geography of the world, those emissions coming off the satellite photographs of the world at night, that there's 200 nations in the world, that really the defining elements of the world economy were 40 mega regions, the Boston, New York, Washington complex, the area from Chicago to Detroit to Pittsburgh, Northern California, Southern California, our own mega region, which I conveniently named Tor-Buffchester, but that's also neither here nor there. It's not China, that's the new competitor, it's the Beijing-Shanghai axis. It's not India, it's the Mumbai-Bangalore corridor. It's not Brazil, it's the area that runs from Sao Paulo, and so on. I could go on and on about this. But those mega regions, the four house about 18% of the world's population, produce 2/3 of its economic output, and 9 in 10 of its innovations. But it gets better or worse. One of the things we've been tracking here at the Institute is the geography of high-tech industry and high-tech startups supported by venture capital. There are lots of people who like to talk about the rise of the rest. And I'm very supportive of that. I worked very hard to help Pittsburgh rise to the extent that it could. People talk about the rebirth of Detroit, a city that we both run and I both care very deeply about. But here's a fact for you. In the year 1990, 22% of venture capital-backed startups were in the San Francisco Bay Area. Today, 50% are. There are 2 neighborhoods in downtown San Francisco that were formerly burned-out warehouse districts when I began studying high-technology industry. Those 2 neighborhoods attract more than $1 billion in venture capital investment each annually, more than any other nation, save for the United States, on the planet. Our world is not becoming spread out. For the things that really matter, they are becoming more and more concentrated. So the first dimension of the new urban crisis is winner-take-all urbanism, where London and New York and San Francisco and Toronto and another small group of cities, a couple of dozen, maybe 3 dozen cities around the world capture disproportionate gains. And what's so interesting about this is if a city like London or New York or Toronto used to be strong in finance or media and entertainment, other than San Francisco, guess which are the only cities that have seen any real appreciable gain in high technology startups? New York City today, in that same area that I studied as a young student, that same area of Lower Manhattan, which had not a single high-tech startup then, now attracts more venture capital per year than Silicon Valley proper. And it's approaching double. Think about this. The place that houses Facebook and Apple and Intel, now New York City, London, and Toronto are the only places that have made appreciable gains in venture capital-backed startups. So they've added technology to their mix of industries of finance and media and entertainment and these high-velocity, high-value-added, highly innovative industries. We are seeing a level of spatial inequality. It's not economic inequality that is the real central issue of our time. A level of spatial inequality. And I just want you guys to understand this. In fact, the U.S., which gave rise to Trump, has one of the lowest levels of spatial inequality of any advanced country. A simple rubric. In the United States, the 5 largest metros produce 1/4 of GDP. In Canada, the 5 largest metros produce 50% of GDP. And in South Korea, 1 metro, Seoul, produces 50% of GDP. Our world is incredibly spatially unequal, and that is causing the backlash that we see. The second dimension of the new urban crisis is the crisis of the winner cities. So the winners look like winners through one lens, but the same winner cities, the big victors of winner-take-all urbanism, also face a deep and deepening crisis of their own, a crisis of their very success. Now, partly that crisis is looked at through the lens of gentrification and the change in urban neighborhoods. And this is really important. Up until about the year 2000, the urban revival, which was washing over cities like New York, like London, San Francisco, and Toronto, was somewhat muted. So when I was writing Rise of the Creative Class, one could still be aspirational about the nature and importance of engaging the comeback of cities, the return to cities, the back to the city movement, the urban revival. According to the really pioneering research of my colleague Nate Baum-Snow, who we were so fortunate to recruit from Brown University in Providence to the Rotman School and to the University of Toronto, Nate's work nails this down so that the urban revival that we see en masse is a product of the period from 2000 to now, where a whole set of forces combine to produce an urban comeback to the city, movement back to the city effect on steroids. Where this is once pockets of big superstar cities like New York and London and San Francisco and Boston, Seattle and Toronto, it's now begun to affect many more cities. One way we can think about this is which is the issue today in Toronto, is the housing affordability crisis. Now, in the book, I talk about this. And by the way, online, we have a supplement at our Martin Prosperity Institute website, which you can go to, a supplement written for Canada specifically, because, trust me, American publishers they cut 50,000 words out of the book as it was, and they only wanted to talk about big U.S. cities. You know, if you talk about London or Toronto, they think you're, I don't know, it's just an American thing. So we built a whole Canadian supplement. We're also developing a whole European edition. But when you look at the data, yeah, it may cost more to buy an apartment in New York or a flat in London. But according to the best data we have, which compares median housing prices to median income, Toronto right now is the 9th most expensive or least affordable place in the world. It is less affordable in the aggregate than the New York metropolitan area. And Vancouver is the 3rd least affordable metro in the world. Only Hong Kong and Sydney are more expensive. So say what we will, say that housing prices are less expensive, say that Toronto it is in the vortex of this new urban crisis. So that's the second dimension. And you know, I learned this from my MBA students because we do this exercise. Poor kids. My heart goes out to them having to suffer through me a dozen times a semester. But we do this exercise in picking a place to live. They all want to live here, to a person. And then we say, and the neighborhoods have changed. Over the time I've done this course, trust me, the aspirational neighborhoods have changed. So about a year ago, we were having this conversation, and I said, how can you guys, and this is obviously the Rotman School, MBAs, the most advantaged, kids are going to make the most, likely make among the most money in Canada in their generation. How are you guys going to afford to buy a home in a nice neighborhood? And they said, well, that's easy, Professor Florida. The bank of mom and dad. Bank of mom and dad. So not only does it depend on your parents, and I think about myself, a working class kid with parents with no education, in a Catholic school, could get into the state university, Rutgers College, could find myself a little crappy apartment in New York. Now, not only is it much more competitive to go to university, not only are you competing with kids from around the world, not only do the advantages that are handed down, the socioeconomic advantages of parentage, of affluence, position you for the right university, now to position yourself in the right labor market, to be able to benefit from the fruits of these superstar cities and knowledge hubs, you need an additional benefit of class position for mom and dad to be able to enable you to live there. On my Porter flight last week, I was sitting across from the jump seat. So we got to talking. And the flight attendant from Porter said that he pays $900 a month in rent to share an apartment in Kensington Market with 9 other people. Look, the success has brought with it some unintended and other very troubling consequences. The third dimension of the new urban crisis. If the old urban crisis was a crisis of the center city, of the urban core, of its abandonment, not as bad here, but certainly in the United States, wholesale abandonment of most cities, The new urban crisis is bigger because it has spread to the suburbs. In fact, in the book, we document that the level of poverty, the level of economic distress is now greater in America's suburbs. We don't remember because of the Hart administration. We had a little interlude in Canada where we have no reasonable data to look at this. But when the census comes out, we'll be able to look at it. So I have to defer to American information. And even my smartest colleagues here try to estimate, but they say there's terrible inconsistencies and skew in the data. But there's more poverty in the suburbs. There's more economic distress in the suburbs. The opioid crisis is clustered in the suburbs. Crime and violence is rising at a rate that outdistances the urban. As wealthier people have come back to the city center, according to the estimates of Jed Kolko, a brilliant young economist working in the private sector, the way he phrases it is the top 10% of the income distribution has come back to cities, and the bottom 10% of the income distribution has been pushed out to the suburbs. So it is a crisis that extends to the suburb. I had a fascinating, he's still alive, colleague at Carnegie Mellon. His name is David Lewis. He's in his mid-90s. David is really a Jane Jacobs, he's a South African guy, a Jane Jacobs-like figure of urban design. He told me this years ago. He said, Florida, you thinking about the center city and the old crisis of the city, see your city of Newark, Detroit, you can go to any city, and they have marvelous. When John and I go and see the American Thanksgiving parade in Detroit and walk over to the football game, not her favorite thing to do on Thanksgiving, by the way, the infrastructure in downtown Detroit, the spectacular buildings, even in Newark. Newark has a Whole Foods. I'm not kidding you. It got a Whole Foods in the past month. When you look at the buildings and the parks, it's spectacular. They were in disarray and decline, but they're there. You know, David said it's Florida with his great South African man. Florida, wait till you see what happens to the suburbs with their shoddy construction and those poorly built houses. It's going to fall apart. And he was absolutely right. The fourth dimension of the new urban crisis. And this I learned from Rob Ford, but in particular I learned it from our colleague David Holchansky. In the wake of this, David published his remarkable study of the three cities of Toronto. The first city of Toronto was the city of a middle class and of a Canadian dream. A city that not only had a vibrant middle class, and this is important, it's not just that the middle class jobs are in decline as our economy is split into highly paid knowledge, professional and creative jobs, and much lower paid food preparation, retail, clerical, home health service jobs. The middle-class neighborhoods that were the platform of the Canadian dream have declined. That was City 1. And it's been replaced by two new cities. A city of advantage, which I mentioned before, clustered in and around the downtown, close to employment opportunity, close to amenity, close to subways, which eased the commute, around all sorts of other amenity, and a much larger third city of people pushed aside. Well, in the book I say the defining feature, influenced by David's work, the defining feature of the new urban crisis is the evisceration of the middle-class neighborhoods that were the platforms for social mobility in the Canadian or American dream. The neighborhood I was born in, Newark, is gone. The neighborhood I was brought up in North Arlington, is over. The neighborhood Jane Jacobs lived in, Hudson Street, is in Hudson Street. Nor is the annex where, according to the periodical of record, Toronto Life, a vacant lot is currently for sale. Am I the only one who read that? For $5 million. We'll buy you one vacant lot in the annex. These neighborhoods, which were vibrant, middle-class, integrated, cohesive neighborhoods, have been obliterated. Holchansky's figures for Toronto are daunting, and his colleagues' figures from Vancouver and Montreal are equally so, but here's the data for the United States of America. In the year 1970, two-thirds of Americans lived in a middle-class neighborhood. And now, the most current data, which is based on the 2010 census, so that's already 7 years ago, is 40%. I can bet you that when the next census comes out, it's going to be less than a third. So that's cut in half. According to the research by the Pew Center, in 203 of 229 metros they could collect data from, the middle class has declined. It is not just the middle class that is falling by the wayside that gets some attention. And Peter Tannen, the great economic historian at MIT, has a fabulous book on this just out. The middle class neighborhoods, which are platforms for socioeconomic mobility, have been eviscerated. Guess where this is worse? And this gets to the nub of the new urban crisis. And the book has all of these statistics. We measure income inequality and wage inequality. And again, on this, my colleague Nate Bound-Snow has done the most important work. As metropolitan areas grow larger and denser, wage and income inequality rise. We measure income segregation, which we actually think this spatial inequality is a much more damning. In Edward Glazer's review of the book in the Wall Street Journal this weekend, he agreed that segregation, this segmentation of group, the creation of these geographically isolated islands, that these worlds apart, or is more, well, we measure income segregation, wealth segregation, poverty segregation, educational segregation, segregation of the college educated, the segregation of knowledge workers, service workers. Across all of them, as a metropolitan area or city gets larger, gets denser, gets more knowledge-based, gets more technologically innovative, all good things. All of these good things produce higher levels of inequality, higher levels of segregation. Where has the middle class shrunk the most? In our most technologically dynamic, most knowledge-driven, most innovative cities. Where does the middle class remain? In the places that are the least vibrant and the most stagnant. That is the heart of the new urban crisis. And one last dimension, which, especially in a city that's so diverse and so global as this one, I would be remiss not to mention. If the new urban crisis is bad in Canada, if the new urban crisis is bad in the United States, if the new urban crisis is reshaping Europe, it's worse across the developing world. For the first time in modern memory, economists are now suggesting that we are experiencing a phenomenon that has not happened for the past couple of centuries, which they call urbanization without growth. The development of the United Kingdom, of most of continental Europe, of the United States and Canada, of the advanced parts of Asia, urbanization, industrialization, economic growth, and the development of a rising living standard in the middle class went hand in hand. But in parts of the most rapidly emerging urban areas of the world, that has been sundered. Well, globalization plays a role. You no longer can get the development of an agricultural hinterland or an industrial hinterland like we had in Toronto when things are supplied through global supply chains. There are many refugees, as we know, coming in, streaming off from the countryside because of conflicts and all sorts of other problems. 860 million people around the world today live in global slums. 860 million people. You know what that amounts to? That's Canada, the United States, and the EU combined. And in the words of one of my Chinese students who put it so much more aptly than me, said, Professor Florida, you have a great life, you live a middle-class life, you live in a nice neighborhood, you have a nice job. You're a member of the middle class, or the professional class, the creative class. He said, my prospects in Shanghai are better than yours. I will experience more mobility in my life going up the ladder and probably accumulate more wealth than you will. And he said, but the people who live outside Shanghai, they live in pre-civilized conditions. So that's the dimension of the new urban crisis. Now I have to tell you, that sounds kind of gloomy. And a number of my critics have suggested that I've turned from Mr. Optimism to Mr. Gloomy Gus. But I'm actually not gloomy. And here's why. Because I watched the old urban crisis turn into an urban revival. And I actually think that was the harder part of the story. To turn our cities that had been, I see some of my urban economist colleagues, so I have to say this, but that people like the great Hoover and Vernon wrote about in the late 1950s, that we were experiencing a flight from density, that our future was quintessentially suburban, that people were going to depopulate and repopulate themselves in these greenfield suburbs. To see that what Jane Jacobs wrote about, the seeds of her idea, that Robert Lucas, the Nobel Prize winner, said, is the basic fundamental mechanism of economic growth, this clustering of human beings in cities. To see this come back, to see where Toronto is, what happened in New York in those burned out neighborhoods, walking the Highline Park last week and seeing what's happened there, seeing the rise of Hudson Yards, seeing the tour. I was like I was in downtown Japan. I was like in Shinjuku. Like I couldn't move. There were so many tourists. What was so amazing, by the way, I had never seen it before, but this is a credit to our great President Donald Trump. The rainbow flags hanging out of the old apartment buildings as those tourists from every part of the world walk by to understand what the High Line really was about. But to see this rejuvenation, to see what's happening in downtown Detroit, to see what's happened in Pittsburgh. I've been in Columbus, Ohio, unbelievable. Kansas City, unreal. Indianapolis, I can go down the list of the places I've been in the past month to see something that I could not have imagined 15 years ago. Well, we did that. For the past 10 or 15 years, groups of urban economists here at the University of Toronto and urban social scientists, people like Ed Glazer at Harvard, Bruce Katz and Amy Liu at Brookings, I could go on, Mike Porter at Harvard, literally created the tools which enable, and you can go to any little hamlet. I recently presented at the Inter-American Development Bank. And they were saying, what's so striking about Latin and South America is you can go from city to city, and there's no economic development office, and the city and the mayor and the city manager don't understand the local economy. You can go any city in town throughout Canada, the United States. They know their clusters. They know their economic drivers. They know how to attract talent. They know what their universities can contribute. They understand economic development, but they just haven't understood that it's splintering and divisive. Actually, the shift we have to make over the next 10 to 15 years, and we're going to do it here, with Merrick's support and this university's support, we're going to do it here. And we're going to partner with others. We have a great partnership with Brookings right now and others. Making this shift from winner-take-all urbanism to urbanism for all is not as daunting as bringing our city back in the first place. So the shift we have to make is from a kind of clustering that excludes to a kind of clustering that includes. We have to make the case, and that's what this book is really about. That's what the Clarion Call is about. If the rise of the creative class was how to make cities come back, how to attract knowledge workers, how to leverage economic strengths, this book is about how to make our cities more inclusive. Every city I've gone to. Here. I couldn't believe it. They said, when you talk to the ULI, the Urban Land Institute, do you mind if the premier engages in a conversation? Do I mind? Of course. This is exactly the conversation I want to have. In Columbus, Ohio, do you mind if we put the mayor of Columbus and the mayor of Findlay and the mayor of Youngstown? In Indianapolis, do you mind if the Chamber of Commerce board enters in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia? Do you mind if the heads of the universities and the big Mars Lake Incubator, the City Science Center, engages in this conversation? Everyone sees it. Everyone knows that the next move has to be towards a more inclusive prosperity. So that's what the book is really about. In the few remaining moments, I want to give you what I think, and it's not rocket science. This is stuff we all know. I think what the book tries to do is create a narrative and really make the case to mayors and urban leaders, city builders, that this is the kind of framework we need. And now we have to build the tools, and we have to build the data infrastructure, but we'll do it because I can see it. I can feel it. As I talk all around this country and all around the United States, I can see the demand for this. The first thing is we have to build more. Now, we say we're building a lot, but we're not building nearly enough in a city like Toronto, never mind New York or San Francisco, to keep up. Now, if we have a backlash from the right, here we have a backlash from the left. And the backlash from the left is what people have come to call the not in my backyard syndrome, the NIMBY syndrome. Well, I live in a lovely neighborhood, and I have my lovely home, and I don't want more traffic, and I don't want anything, and I certainly don't want a subway. In Washington, D.C., they made that subway go around Georgetown. I don't want all of this hoity-toity kind of thing going on in my neighborhood. Look, I live in Rosedale. They don't even want a frickin' path to go to the ravine. Sorry, I didn't say that. Holy God, like when we go with Rana's mom, she's stumbling down. We try to take the baby. Put the damn path in. Let people use the ravine. I saw this when I wrote a thought experiment. Don't crucify me, really. I wrote a thought experiment for the Toronto Star suggesting that we might want to think about, perhaps consider maybe that the island airport could land jets because maybe that would be good for our economy because places that have people were going to like string me up. Let's open our minds. In San Francisco, this was defeated. Not only did they protest the buses that bring the tech workers to Google and to the companies because they want to live in a city, they wanted to put a moratorium on high-tech startups. Oh, that would be great for the economy. To put a moratorium on the thing that creates jobs and generates wealth. In LA, they wanted to ban luxury high-rise construction. I call this, and my great colleague, Professor Glazer, he gave me credit for this. He said he enjoyed my turn of phrase. This is not NIMBYs. These are the new urban Luddites. These are the equivalent of the people who smashed the machines in England because they were afraid the machines would put the artisans out of work. Look, the only way our cities are going to scale, the only way we're going to grow bigger cities, if we can build bigger and taller and create the density we need and invest. There's a reason there's so few New Yorks and Londons. Because there's so few cities that can get over this hump. When a city gets to 4 or 5 million people, 6 million people in the metro, you can't grow by suburban expansion and protecting little beautiful neighborhoods and driving around in a car. You have to grow differently. The second thing we need to do, because luxury towers are not enough, and we know what's happened here. We built luxury towers, and we still have one of the greatest affordable housing problems in the world. It's as bad in New York and London. We've got to commit to building affordable rental housing. There are lots of ways to do it. I'm not an expert in which one of them is the best. We need to try a whole bunch of things. But for sure, we should stop subsidizing suburban development out in the periphery. And do that with a mortgage tax deduction. We still subsidize infrastructure. We don't charge people to use the roads. We have to stop it. And we have to commit to making sure that we have affordable rental housing. My dad could buy a cheap little suburban box house outside of Newark. Cost him $15,000. He could drive his car. That's no longer what we need. We need a new way of adjusting our housing market. The third thing we need to do is we need to invest. Well, you know this better than I. You live in Toronto. I live in Toronto. We need to invest in transit. This place is, the car thing here is just crazy. This is just insane. Look, the traffic here is the worst. I think it's the worst in North America. I think it even now tops Los Angeles. It is unbelievable. New York City, I can get to the airport in a flash. Not here. The roads are clogged because we've run out of capacity. So we need to invest in transit. We need to invest in transit not only because transit is good, because it connects our suburbs. It connects our city. The reason New York and London can scale is because those old crappy subway systems and tubes, and New York's is now under collapse. This is the most amazing thing. Being up in New York City, I tape the NewsHour, PBS. It should run pretty soon. But we're in the subway stations and in Penn Station. It is now just falling apart. There's derailments, trains. It's just insane what's happening. People now call it just commuter hell. And our city's transit systems are just over capacity. It's a 100-year-old legacy good that we've not invested in or kept up with. We've got to invest in transit to connect these outlying, create hubs of development around transit, and we've got to think, at least in clustered and dense places, about investing in high-speed rail. The only way we're really going to grow this regional corridor is when we can connect, Waterloo and Kitchener and Hamilton in a way and make them part of the commuting set. There's a fantastic paper, by the way, little academic wonky note for you guys, by two famous urban economists talking about the cost of land use restrictions to the U.S. economy. They estimate, and I think the estimate is about the same for Canada, they estimate that, let's say, land use restrictions in San Francisco and New York that impede development cost about 9% of GDP a year. So that's like $1.5 trillion, a non-trivial sum. There's a footnote in that paper which says, but by the way, if we had better transit and better high-speed rail connections in places like San Francisco and New York, we could increase the functional labor market in a way that would far exceed the benefits of eliminating land use restrictions. So transit and high-speed rail, we have to make service jobs better jobs. We can no longer condemn half of our workforce in a big city like Toronto to crappy low-wage work and just say, oh, we'll either bring back manufacturing or educate people into the knowledge class. It ain't going to work. There are literally half of us who work in the precariat. We do low-wage, routine service work, food prep, food service, retail, clerical, home health care aides. Like my dad told me the story. He got a job in 1934 at age 13 in the factory. It took 9 people to make a living wage. My grandfather, my grandmother, my dad, and his 6 siblings. And they split their townhouse with my grandfather's 2 brothers. So that means it took 30 people to keep one household going. 30 people, more or less, rough estimate. My dad said, you know, I came back from the war, Rich. And as if by magic, I went back to the same factory. I had the same job. All of a sudden, I had enough money to buy a car, to get married, to buy a house, to have 2 kids, to put you 2 kids through Catholic school, and to put you through university. Well, it wasn't magic. We decided as a society we would pay people more to make cars. Henry Ford said, we got to pay them enough to buy the cars. Lincoln Filene, the retail magnate, said, we're not going to have demand and grow the economy until workers have the money. We had a Wagner Act in the United States that gave people the right to collectively bargain and organize. We had a social safety net, a New Deal in this society and others, social democracy in Europe. We can make service jobs better jobs. It means we're going to have to pay a little more for the people who serve us food, take care of us in hotels, provide care for our kids and our aging parents. But if we could do that for the people who built our cars and television sets and refrigerators, it's just as easy, maybe it's better. Now, maybe those people are women, and maybe they're from different ethnic groups, but let's get over it. We've got to build a new middle class, and we have to do that. And, of course, in the book, I talk about the way to do that. Our colleague at the NPR, our fellow, Zinette Tom, who works at MIT, who shows reasonably well, she's in the lean production group, that if you pay retail workers and hospitality workers more, if you engage them in continuous improvement, and you engage them in what they call lean production, if you have them contribute their knowledge, they drive productivity and profit up. We need a basic guaranteed income. We need higher minimum wages. So I could go on, but one last story. So Ron and I decided, I think it was November 8th, it's the day of the U.S. election, right? That we were going to, the Americans who live in town were going to have an election party. And so I could show you the pictures. I'm not good with slides, but, you know, we dressed up the little baby in red, white, and blue. We dressed up the little dog in a flag vest. Ronna got her sisters to bring a Hillary Clinton statue and a Donald Trump statue. And we're all so incredibly happy, and we're having fun. And at about 7:30, I just started to look at my phone. And by about 8:15, it was like, oh, shit. And I just shut up and didn't say a word. And we tried to get to sleep, and Ronna got up in the morning, and she said something. And I was standing near the TV, and she said, you know, Richard, we feel like crap today. It's awful, because Donald Trump won. But she said, you know, we're here in Toronto. We have this great house. You have this great job. We have these great careers. We're pretty advantaged. Imagine how the Trump nation would feel if Mrs. Clinton won. And then the light bulb went off. And I called my publisher, and she was not happy with me. And I said, I have to rewrite the book from top to bottom. So I got to work and rewrote the book. And in the original version of the book, I called for, and maybe we can still do it here, that new President Clinton should establish a council of cities. The mayors should be on it. Urban leaders should be on it. Real estate developers, university presidents, urbanists. It should be equivalent to the National Economic Council. It should be equivalent to the National Security Council. We need a major new investment in cities. And then there's Trump. And then I realized Trump wasn't the problem. It was the new urban crisis that was the problem. How I couldn't see it, I don't know. I saw Rob Ford. I thought of it. We're divided. 50-50 divided. From people who want to live in urban areas with knowledge institutions and transit, call them blue, and people who want to live in suburbs and further out, and they want big houses and cars. And we are divided, and it goes like this, see, saw. And we're not immune. You can say what you want, but we had Ford first. We can claim first priority on this one. So it's not something that's just happening in America. It's happening in France. It's happening in the Netherlands. It's happening here. So I got my email out, and I sent an email to my main nemesis, my most argumentative nemesis, a person who the name won't mean much. His name is Joel Kotkin. Joel Kotkin is Mr. Suburbia if I'm Mr. Urbia. And I said, Joel, let's talk. We got to put our heads together. And here's what I thought. We got to learn to live together. If not, we're going to just pull apart. Red and blue, conservative and liberal, urban and suburban, we've got to learn to live together and respect one another. What's the way to do it? Now, I learned this from Canada. We're not as anxious because the stakes for our national federal office aren't high. People in America are nervous because Trump has enormous power. We call it the imperial presidency. He's the most powerful person in the world, and that office just has way too much power. How? Why would you put that much power in one person? Now, I guess if, luckily, 45 of them or so have been pretty good, but 46, wow, bummer. You got a real bozo with his finger on the nuclear trigger. So then I thought about, our provinces have more power. And our federal government has less. And then I thought, we have a vertical separation of powers. We can fine-tune that. We amped it up after the war and said the president or the prime minister should be more powerful for a whole variety of reasons. But we can turn it down. We can reduce the stakes by empowering provinces. No, cities and communities. So that's what I've really come to. There is no one-size-fits-all strategy. The problems of Toronto or Vancouver are really different than the problems of Hamilton or Windsor. The problems of New York or London look very different than the problems of Detroit or Cleveland or Houston or Dallas, never mind Akron or Kansas City. That the only way we're going to grapple with this is to put power in the hands of local people. So what that means is we have to build a whole new governance model. This is the daunting part. We have to build a whole new governance model which takes power from the top and decentralizes it from the United States, from the president to the local, here, from the province to the local. And I think it can be done. And I think it can be done for two reasons. One, there is an incredible convergence of thought in left and right. For every person who tilts left, like myself or Bruce Katz, the late, great Benjamin, what a tragic loss, the late, great Benjamin Barber, just this month, to people on the right, like Yuval Levin, who writes for the National Review, are all saying the same thing. Jonathan Haidt, that if we devolve power to the local level, we reduce the stakes at the national level, and we empower the people, I don't know. I really don't know which mayors are a liberal or which mayors are a conservative, which ones are a Democrat and a Republican. Half the time when I try to guess, I get it wrong. So this is the level where partisan ideology doesn't matter. And here's where I think Canada has a good shot. In the United States, mayors are really going to have to go it alone. There will be no help from the federal government. And if you look at the map, it's not just the federal government. In the United States, the states are mainly red. And the state legislatures who control the power are redder still. In Canada, we have an incredible moment. And in Toronto, an even greater moment. We have a federal government that understands the nature of investment in cities. We have a wonderful debate, but a provincial government, a wonderful debate about how the provinces could invest in our cities. And there's no right or wrong. There's a debate on this. And we have a set of mayors in this country, not only in Toronto, but people like Don Iveson and Naheed Nenshi, who are really among the most interesting mayors in the world. Combine that with the fear of Trump's immigration restrictions. And there is an enormous opportunity in this city and this country to do it right. But not if we simply go down the path of more innovation and knowledge, not if we simply go down the path of more if we understand fundamentally and once and for all that the only way to make it work is to move from winner-take-all urbanism to urbanism for all, from a kind of prosperity and clustering that divides to an inclusive prosperity that all can benefit and prosper from. Thank you so much for listening to me.
So 4 quick things in closing. First of all, I think Rich is sticking around for a little bit to sign some books out in the hall. Before I tell you what I love about Richard Florida, I'm going to tell you what I hate about Richard Florida. Most people with a week-old baby are incoherent. To be so coherent as to give a heavily cited hour-long speech without notes I'm proud of you, but I also dislike you intensely at this moment. So thank you for that. Third is, a lot of people come on our stage, especially through our Shift to Server series, with a great idea. Very few people change the conversation. And Richard has done that at least once in his career, and we're going to help support him try to do it again. But more importantly, he does it with decency and humanity, and is just an overall good guy. So that's appreciated. And if you aren't feeling bullish enough about being Canadian tonight, I would encourage you to come tomorrow night. The New York Times will be in town at 5:30 till 7 o'clock, where they will come under the auspices of journalism talking about our immigration and refugee system, and we get to pound our chests and talk about how awesome we are, not only just to ourselves, but in comparison to what's happening south of the border. So please do join us tomorrow night. With that, enjoy your evening, and thank you for coming.